Chapter 3. It took 5 nights of practice before Harry was able to wiggle the bolt on his cupboard open with a bent nail. There wasn't much of a crack between the door and the wall, only enough to slide a few millimeters at a time, and the bolt was heavy enough that if he wasn't pressing at just the right angle the nail would slide instead of moving the bolt. Harry persisted, counting the seconds in his head as he levered the bolt, hoping each night that he could slip it free before the second hour after sunset. Each time when he failed, he had to painstakingly lever it back into place before allowing himself to sleep. It wouldn't do to raise suspicions. Finally, the 6th night, the fates seemed to conspire in his favor. Uncle Vernon had gone to bed early with a headache, Aunt Petunia was in the study taking care of accounting, and Dudley had gone to visit one of his friends for the evening. An hour after dark, Harry had the cupboard open, slipped out as silently as a serpent and quietly bolted the door behind him. He tiptoed to the back door, left unlocked to await Dudley's return later that night, and slipped out without a sound. He walked slow and quiet down the walk, his heart pounding with nervousness, staying close to the hedge until he was well out of sight of the upstairs windows in case his aunt happened to glance outside. As soon as Harry was out on the sidewalk, he broke into a run. He had 40 minutes by his count, which would be plenty of time to reach the park at a walk, but everything was going so well he was terrified that he would arrive only to find he had missed the allotted time. Harry had to slow before he was halfway, out of breath. In his desperate desire to reach the park on time, he'd failed to pace himself and pushed much harder than he was used to. He held his side, walked as quickly as he could manage toward his destination. His head ached, the exhaustion pulsing through him as he tried to recover. He hurried on, tingling with excitement that almost drowned out his weariness. He was going to meet someone else like him. Someone with a secret, rare ability that he had only discovered so recently. Another Slytherin, whatever the strange word meant. He reached the park, only to be confronted with another problem. It was occupied by dozens of people. Couples, joggers, people waiting for the bus. Harry looked around, tried to see if anything seemed out of place, if there was anyone who gave an indication of being different. No one within his sight seemed unusual. He walked toward the center of the park, looking around slowly and carefully, suddenly acutely aware that he was out alone at night. Even Dudley wasn't supposed to be this far from home alone. It wasn't safe. "Are you lost, dear?" Harry jumped at the voice, accompanied by a hand on his shoulder. He whirled to face the woman who'd spoken. "No. I'm meeting someone. He should be right over there. Thank you." He gestured vaguely toward the other end of the park, ducked away from her and ran. What was he thinking coming out here on the word of a snake? Snake. He stopped short, knelt on the ground, looked around. "Hello," he hissed quietly. "Anyone down here? Can you tell me where Master Not Master is?" "I'm right here," came a voice, quiet, hissing, but distinctly human. Harry straightened, turned slowly. His forehead was aching worse now, exhaustion and fear and something more. A man stood there, cloaked in black. The first thing Harry noticed was the bright green stone and the heavy gold ring on the man's hand, before his gaze traveled up to the hooded face. What little Harry could see appeared much younger than Uncle Vernon or his occasional visitors. The man was probably in his 30s. His lips were curved up in a gentle smile. "Greetings, fellow Heir," he whispered, still in that hissing voice that Harry knew instinctively was the same as serpents spoke. "Heir to the snakes, the Slytherin?" Harry asked. His heart was still pounding. Harry felt his hands trembling with nervousness. He didn't want to seem ignorant, but he wanted information, and he had the horrible feeling that with this man he would not get a second chance at anything. The man's smile changed, a tempered curious look. "Heir of Slytherin," he translated. "Though to a snake, the word you are saying means only Slytherin, and you are too young to have been sorted." Harry did not understand this at all. "You wanted to meet me?" he asked, looking down at the man's ring again, his voice faint. "I don't want to bother you with too many questions." "It is no bother, young Heir. We must get to know one another very well, after all." Harry felt a shiver run through him, starting at his forehead and slipping icily down his whole body. "Why?" he asked, unable to manage more than the single word. He was suddenly very afraid of this man, and cursed himself for rushing off to a secret meeting like this at night. "Don't be afraid. Look into my eyes." Harry slowly raised his head. The man had pushed his hood back a bit, exposing the rest of his face. It was not a sinister face at all. He looked kindly, though a bit stern. His smile shifted again, becoming almost sad. "I am a teacher at an exclusive boarding school," the man said, his eye searching Harry's. "My name is Quirinus Quirrell." I have reason to believe that you will shortly be extended an invitation to attend this school. As I am a professor there and you have had no exposure to our world, I thought it wise to come and introduce you to the truth in person." He gestured with one hand, and a large snake's head emerged from his sleeve. "This is Nagini, my close friend and confidant. It is she who worked tirelessly on my behalf to arrange this meeting." "Greetings, smaller master," she hissed, bobbing her head respectfully to Harry. Harry nodded back. "I'm pleased to meet you, Nagini." The fear was seeping out of him now, but that only brought the evening chill to his notice. Harry wished he had a coat. Quirinus Quirrell seemed to notice his discomfort. "Oh, how foolish of me. Here, let me." He turned to the side, moved his arm in a careful motion, then pulled a thick cloak of dark fabric that matched his own out from his other sleeve. He held this out to Harry. "Do you want to walk, or sit down?" he asked. This conversation could take some time. Harry wrapped the cloak around himself, warm and comfortable. He glanced over, saw an empty park bench nearby. "We could sit," he offered tentatively. The professor smiled, and Harry wondered what other things he hid in those big sleeves of his. Nagini slithered out and off into the darkness, to hunt for her dinner if Harry's guess was correct. He usually was, with snakes. He had much experience with them and good instincts. They crossed to the bench, sat down. "I am sure you have a great many questions already, young Harry," the professor said, folding his hands in his lap. "You may ask them whenever you wish. I shan't think less of you for the curiosity. I am a teacher first and foremost, and an eager mind full of questions is one of the greatest gifts a teacher can find in a student." Harry nodded, but wasn't ready to speak yet. They sat in silence a moment, then the professor continued before the quiet could grow uncomfortable. "You have spoken with snakes for several months now," he said. "And from what they tell me, you have tried to converse with them for as long as you've been living here. Why?" "Well, sir, they were always around. I wasn't allowed a real pet, so I got used to them, and they seemed so much more faithful." There. Harry's words stopped. He found he couldn't explain his emotions. "I understand," the professor said softly. "I too lived a lonely childhood. It was my greatest joy to discover the simple, undemanding friendship of serpentkind. We too, alone in this generation, understand what a true gift we have been given." "Are we the only?" Harry remembered the translation, "Slytherins in London." The professor laughed, softly. "No, that is not the right word. I'm sorry, I forget how much you don't know. Slytherin is a house in my school, one of 4, and the surname of its founder. Heir of Slytherin would be the term you are looking for, as serpentkind know only Slytherin's true descendants and consider them as the same thing. But he hesitated. The proper word in our language for people who can talk to snakes is parselmouth, and the language and ability to speak it is called parseltongue. And unfortunately for you and I, the ability carries a bit of a stigma in our world." Harry sat quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. "What kind of stigma?" he asked at length. He'd never heard of a parselmouth, but then his social education was hardly the most extensive. Dudley saw to that. The professor sighed. "Unfortunately, the founder of Slytherin House, our great ancestor and the one from whom the parseltongue ability is passed, after the founding of the school, was cast out after an argument with his fellow founders. The 3 who remained passed down their ancient feud, with the result that Slytherin's house is seen as corrupt, manipulative, and even evil. Perception can shift reality, and sadly the members of the house accepted and conformed to the way they were seen. Not completely, of course. There are still those of strength and cunning, who properly carry on Slytherin's legacy. Myself, the head of House Severus Snape, a handful of others." "I understand," Harry said quietly, staring at his feet. "When outnumbered, forced into a role, you accepted it or paid for it. The fact that these Slytherins had been forced into a role that brought dishonor upon their ancestor was a terrible tragedy." Harry looked up. "You said we were heirs. Do you mean that we are actually related to Slytherin's line somehow?" "Yes." "Well," again the professor hesitated, as though changing what he'd been about to say. "There are many who are related to his line. He lived centuries ago, but you and I are the only 2 in whom his gift for parseltongue manifested. Therefore, we are the closest to his bloodline, his true heirs. And those to whom serpentkind will lend obedience and trust." "It's very rare?" Harry asked. "The ability to talk to snakes?" "Incredibly rare. Even among those related, it has only shown itself in me, and now you, in recent decades." Harry nodded. "And people will think I'm evil if they find out about it." The professor was silent a long moment. "Yes," he said. There are those, Slytherins of the old families, believers in our true calling, who would honor you for the gift. But they are few. Until we reach the school, until you are sorted, I would suggest that you are very careful not to use your ability before others. Once you have a safe place there, we can discuss the future in greater detail. You've said that twice now, sorted, like it's something important. The professor chuckled. I think it is time I told you the full depth of your inheritance. You see, Harry, the ability to talk with snakes is not the only special thing about you. I am going to show you something. It may scare you, but please trust me and do not make a scene. Can you do that? Harry nodded slowly. The professor pulled a thin wooden rod from his sleeve. Loomis, he whispered, and the tip of the rod began to glow. Harry waited. Serpensortia, the professor said, and a spectral serpent appeared from thin air, as though it were a hologram drawn by the rod's glowing tip, then solidified and dropped to the ground with a quiet hiss. Harry blinked. You're some kind of magician, he whispered. How did you do that? The professor's smile twisted, as though he were displeased. Stupefy, he snapped, and a red bolt of light shot out from his rod, hit the coiling snake. The creature fell limp, then disintegrated. Harry leapt to his feet, but stopped himself from shrieking, held his silence until he could speak with a modicum of calmness. His whisper was harsh, but not carrying. You killed it. The professor's smile tightened. It was not real. Serpensortia. Another snake, perfectly identical to the first. Drawn on the air like a shimmer of light, then it solidified and dropped to the ground. This is not a trick, the professor said quietly. This is a true power. The snake is a magical construct which will obey my commands until I release the spell or it is hit with a disruptive or hostile magic. It cannot pass through items, once conjured it is corporeal, but it has no mind or spirit beyond pure command. In this, constructs are inferior to living animals who have a tiny spark of their own intelligence, amplified and brought to sentience by our magic. That's not possible, Harry whispered. The professor waved his wand again, wordlessly, in a complex pattern. The snake on the ground trembled, shrank and expanded, reshaped itself and shimmered until it was a silver goblet. The professor picked it up, handed it to Harry. I can change it to anything, he said quietly. What would it take to convince you? Harry stared at the goblet, once a snake conjured from the air. He didn't know much about magic tricks, but he took a few steps away from the professor to be sure he wasn't going to swap it away quickly. Change it back to a snake, he said. The cup trembled. Harry felt it in his hands as the silvery surface morphed into scales, as it unwound into the same snake that the professor had disintegrated earlier. Are you alive? Harry whispered to it. The snake looked at him expectantly, but did not reply. It felt unnatural, like something essential was missing from it, some tiny spark of mental connection that could be sensed in all living creatures and was inexplicably absent. Harry shuddered, dropped it to the ground. Finite, the professor said, and the snake simply vanished. True power? Harry asked, trembling. This was too much, too strange, too right. It made perfect sense. It was ridiculous. He didn't understand. We call ourselves wizards, Quirrell said, his voice cutting through Harry's confusion. Snakes call us wizards in respect of our name. We are a tiny, tiny portion of the populace, a hidden community that is largely separate from the non-magical folk of the world. Your aunt, uncle, cousin, they have no gift for magic. They are worthless, as I am sure you have seen. The school I work for is called Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. We teach young wizards and witches, which is the female variant of wizard, like yourself, how to use their power. Harry wanted to protest that he had no power, but he could remember too many strange and unbelievable experiences throughout the past year. While one part of him wanted to run home and lock himself in his cupboard and never see another wizard again, the much larger part of him reached out for the knowledge like a plant reaches for the sun. He was special. The Dursleys knew it, and hated him for it. He looked up, met the professor's eyes. I believe you, he said. Those without magic, the professor whispered, stepping closer, we call them muggles. The word in itself is not an insult, nor a compliment. Merely a fact. Like many words, though, it can be used in many ways. Muggle, Harry whispered, the word carrying a harsh edge as he pictured the title applied to his relatives. He smiled, decided he liked the fit of it. Muggles. Muggles are weaker than wizards, in body and mind and spirit. While I do not blame them for their nature, they are still beings with the ability of choice. And their choices have shown me that they are unfailingly petty and foolish creatures. Quirrell met Harry's eyes again. I wish with all my heart that you need not stay in their presence another minute. If I could take you away this very night, bring you to Hogwarts, which is my true home, I would do so. But you are legally under the care of another wizard, whose will it has been that you remain with your blood relatives for no better reason than that they share your mother's ancestry." The professor sounded angry, bitter, as though Harry's experience were somehow his own. He took a breath, slowly, calmly, then reached for Harry's shoulder. Harry flinched instinctively and Quirrell's hand paused, hesitated a few inches away, and he returned it to his opposite sleeve instead. "I am sorry, Harry," he said softly. "I truly am. I have great power, but I cannot save you from the Dursleys. Not yet." "I understand," Harry muttered. He hadn't come here expecting to be freed from them, but for a brief moment his hopes had trembled higher, hoping there would be a loophole, something Quirrell could do for him. The professor took another breath, then his face returned to his half-stern, half-friendly smile. "You must have more questions." "I am a wizard," Harry asked, the term feeling strange on his tongue. He felt arrogant saying it, as though he were laying claim to some great legacy, one he didn't think he deserved. "Not just any wizard," the professor said. "You are of undeniable strength, and bear the legacy of Salazar Slytherin as strongly as myself. You could be the greatest wizard of your era." Harry laughed softly. "I doubt that. I do not seek to cause undue pride, and I do not deceive you," the professor said, his voice stern. "You have potential for greatness beyond anyone else I have ever met." Quirrell smiled, this time smile seemed secretive, ironic. "You are, in fact, already the most famous wizard of your era," he said more quietly. Harry laughed again. "Famous, me? Indeed. Wizarding culture is largely separate from the Muggle world. We have charms of concealment and so cannot be found even by their most advanced technology, so I could understand if you have no knowledge of your true value. Your aunt and uncle did not tell you how your parents died." It was not a question, but Harry answered anyway. "A car crash," he said. "Lies," the professor snapped. "Your parents stood in defiance against the greatest force of conquest the wizarding world had seen since the fall of Grindelwald. Wizards also have the capacity for pettiness and folly, you see, and we are more powerful than Muggles and thus better at performing such deeds. Lord Voldemort, who sought to claim the wizard's world complete, killed your parents before your eyes when you were but a babe. And in vengeance and power, you destroyed him. That is why you are famous, Harry Potter. That is why you carry that scar like a bolt of lightning hidden upon your forehead. That is why every child born to witches knows your name from the cradle. Because you are their savior." Harry swallowed, his throat dry. "I killed someone when I was only a baby?" he asked hoarsely. "Not killed. You destroyed him. Your parents' bodies lay before your crib, while of Lord Voldemort nothing remained but ashes." Harry shook, suddenly glad that the worst he had done to Dudley was lock him in a cage with a snake. If he had the power to burn people to ash when he was only a baby. "You say this school, Hogwarts, can teach me to control my power?" he asked, desperately. "To use it safely?" Professor Quirrell chuckled softly. "Yes, my boy." He hesitated, then held out his hand, wooden rod extended. "Take my wand for a moment, it will help show you something." Harry took it gingerly. "It's cool," he said, surprised. It had been in the professor's hand, in his robes, it should have matched his body temperature. Quirrell's smile widened. "Yes, very good. That is the first indication that you have the gift. You can feel the power within the wand. Some feel warm, some cool, some sharp or soft or glassy. They do not ever feel wholly natural, there is a power to them that matches to the power within us. Now, this is a simple spell. Hold it up in front of you at this angle," he said, holding his own hand in demonstration. Harry copied the motion. Quirrell took hold of the wand to adjust his angle. "Now, say Loomis." "Loomis," Harry said. "No, Loomis," Quirrell repeated. "Not so quickly, use the same timing as mine. Loomis." "Loomis," Harry repeated, and he felt something flicker through him, and a light twinkled for a bare moment at the tip of the wand. Harry's breath caught. "Loomis," he said again. "Loomis. Loomis. Loomis." Finally the light stayed. Dim, fainter by far than that Quirrell had created, but steady and unflickering. The professor's grin widened still farther. "I didn't expect you to manage so much," he whispered, holding out his hand. "I had hoped it would reveal the spark within you, but this with a wand not your own, at your young age? You truly deserve the mantle of legend, and I know it will only grow greater as the years progress." Harry beamed. He had never felt so proud in his life. He handed the wand back to Quirrell, and his light went out. He felt it, knew it with an eighth sense that he couldn't define. He had felt it before, when he vanished the glass at the zoo. When he found himself suddenly safe from Dudley and his gang. But now it was controlled, calm and smooth and readily accessible. Like trapping a thunderstorm's furious rains in a gentle pond. True power, he whispered, watching the wand with eager eyes. You will have your own wand before you arrive at Hogwarts, the professor assured him. Every student gets their own, custom suited to their potential. Your wand will grow with you, shift with you, be your closest ally and truest companion. Trust your wand, and it will never fail you. Though wandless magic can be done, accidentally or occasionally intentionally, use of a wand allows greater strength and near-perfect search control in your spellwork. Harry nodded, his heart beating fast at the memory of the magic that had suffused him, visible like a sound that pulsed through his whole being, inexplicable and pure and deep in his. Then a thought came to him, and his hopes plummeted. I have no fund for schooling, he said dejectedly. I was to attend the local high school, there's no way my aunt and uncle will pay for a specialty school like Hogwarts. Do you think the gratitude of the entire wizarding world is worth so little? Quirrell asked, that ironic tone back in his voice. You are not only famous, Harry, you are wealthy beyond the imagination of most young men your age. Your Hogwarts tuition could be paid 100 times over and still leave you spending money for life. Harry blinked, truly taken aback. His dead hopes began to flutter back to life. Truly? He asked, voice trembling. I told you, I will not lie to you, Quirrell said. Another wizard holds legal custody of your vaults until you come of age, but he has as much of an interest in you attending Hogwarts as I do. Money will not be an obstacle. Harry cast his memory back, tried to remember what questions he still had. He had so much new knowledge, piling on top of itself, he felt overwhelmed. I should return to the school, the professor said quietly, looking into Harry's eyes. I know it is hard for you to escape, but will you meet me here again? You will have more questions, and there is much more you do not even know yet to ask which you should know before you come to us. It would be harmful to your reputation should you arrive ignorant. I don't deserve a reputation, Harry said, still a little uncomfortable at the idea of notoriety. He'd always worked hard to avoid being noticed. Standing out was a sure way to invite trouble. You do. Quirrell's voice was firm, unwavering. Of anyone I have met, you are the one with the most potential. Do not put yourself down, it does no good to yourself or others. You must learn to embrace your strength, the power of your name and reputation. Strength in magic is not the only thing of value within the wizarding community, and you stand in a very good position to monopolize on several. He cut off, tilted his head as though hearing a voice from far away, grimaced. I must go now, he said. Can you meet me again? I will try, Harry said. As soon as possible. Quirrell nodded. If I am not here, ask after Nagini. I will try to send her if I cannot wait for you myself. He strode quickly away, calling in a low hiss for his snake companion. She emerged from the darkness, her dark outline slithering behind the professor like a second shadow. Harry sat down on the bench, and only then realized that he still wore the professor's spare cloak. He jumped up, intending to return it, but as he turned the man and snake vanished with a crack like soft thunder. Harry slowly sank back down to his seat, closed his eyes. So much to absorb. A whole world he'd never known existed. The feel of power. The promise of more. Power and wealth and status. This had to be a dream, Harry decided, but he opened his eyes and found that he still sat on the park bench. The paths were emptier now than when he'd arrived, the bus station quiet and dark. A pair of girls walked by together, heads close, talking about something that made them giggle. Harry knew he should go home, but he wanted to stay here until he could finish processing what he'd been told. He knew that the moment he set foot back in the Dursleys' home he would slip back into himself, into the quiet submissive Harry who was not rich or famous or powerful. He would cower, he would fetch, he would run, he would hide. He gripped the cloak's edge tightly, the fabric a tangible reminder of the truth. He did not need to fear muggles. He was a wizard. He sat several more minutes until, mind settled, he stood and set out toward Privet Drive. He had lost track of time, had no idea how long it had been that he sat and talked with Professor Quirrell. He hoped the door would still be unlocked. He could probably jigger the back window, they left it open a crack for airflow to the furnace and he was probably skinny enough to slip through into the basement. The door at the top of the stairs would be locked, but it would be easier to get through than the front door with actual security systems on it. He cringed, imagining the Dursleys' reaction if they caught him setting off the alarms in the middle of the night. Wizard. Power. He shook his head. Not yet. He couldn't afford to think like that, not for real, not yet. When he was with the professor, when he was at Hogwarts, then he could be strong. Right now, he needed to survive. He was lost in his thoughts as he turned down the familiar street, neared the drive to number 4. He didn't notice the car pull up alongside him until it was too late. Well, look what we have here, came the last voice Harry wanted to hear. My stupid cousin, out walking alone at night? And why do you have a blanket over you? It makes you look even dumber than usual. The car's back door opened, pushed by Malcolm, one of Dudley's friends. Get in, Potter, he said, leering. My house is right there, Harry said, not trying to hide the tremble in his voice. I don't need a ride for 20 feet. Is your friend coming, or not? Asked Malcolm's father from the front of the car. You're letting all the heat out. Dudley sneered at Harry. Coming. Harry wanted to run, but he knew Dudley would be waiting for him by the time he reached number 4. He couldn't stop imagining what terrible punishments his aunt and uncle could devise. He had never in his entire life broken so many rules as he had this night. Nothing he said or did could save him at this point. He climbed into the car, pulled the door closed, buckled his seatbelt. His stomach felt like he had swallowed his heart. Malcolm sat very close to him, pressed him up against the door, whispered threats of violence in Harry's ear, laughed at him. Harry tried to ignore him, didn't try to resist. They pulled into the drive. Dudley threw the door open the moment the car stopped, ran around and yanked Harry's door open just as fast, so quickly that if Harry hadn't been buckled in he would have fallen on his face. Malcolm snickered, hit the release, and Harry flopped out onto the ground. He disentangled himself from the seatbelt, got to his feet. Thank you for the ride, he said quietly to Malcolm's father. The man gave a brusque nod, then Malcolm shut the door with one last sneer. The car backed up, its headlights swept across the yard, then the sound and light of it faded into the distance and left Harry and Dudley alone. So, cousin, Dudley said, grinning evilly. He smacked one hand against the other as if in warm-up. Harry stood frozen, his eyes inexorably drawn toward the movement of Dudley's fist. He felt sick, but didn't dare speak, didn't dare move. Dudley took a step forward, loomed over Harry. You were meant to be locked safely in your cupboard. So what are you doing out on the streets alone at this time of night? Huh? You think my dad will let you get away with this? You think I will? Harry could have said a dozen things. He had a glib insult ready, could easily have pretended to compliment Dudley's sudden increase in vocabulary. His voice was stuck somewhere between his throat and his stomach. He said nothing, tensed for the blow he knew was coming. Brad thinks the world is his to play with, huh? Dudley demanded. Harry wasn't listening, he was watching the hands. I think you need to learn a few important life lessons in respect, Dudley said, and his fist came up. Harry could have run, if he hadn't been frozen with fear. He knew that whatever Dudley did to him was only a precursor to what Uncle Vernon's punishment would be. Though the more Dudley hit him, the less likely Vernon would. It was a worthwhile trade-off. He tried to believe that. But amid the fear and pain, a glimmer of light shone in his mind like hope in a stained glass window. Professor Quirrell's promise that he could attend Hogwarts. They're only muggles. I won't be here forever. Wizards are better than this. Chapter 4. Dudley paraded about the house in his Smelting's uniform, which Harry privately believed had been created solely for the purpose of training people to look pompous despite the fact that anyone they met would laugh uncontrollably. He couldn't imagine any other reason for the mix of color and styles, unless the first class of Smeltings had just gotten a really good deal on boater hats and orange knickerbockers. 2 more weeks had passed since his conversation with the Hogwarts professor in the park, and Harry's cupboard had been upgraded with sliding bars and a padlock. His bedtime was now the minute the dinner dishes are done and he was no longer permitted breakfasts, but on the whole he felt he'd gotten off well. The meeting had been worth it, worth every hungry morning and early imprisonment at night. His rusty nail could not move the bars, and he certainly had no way to reach the padlock. However, he had a new hope now. Magic. Professor Quirrell had said it could be done wandlessly, accidentally or intentionally. Harry knew the feel of it now, knew the extra layer of power that lived within every bit of him. He just had to figure out how to bring it to the surface without the amplificative abilities of a wand, break open the bars, and get away. Despite starting the moment he was locked in for the night and not stopping until he was too tired to carry on, in the 2 weeks since his last escape his progress had been decidedly disappointing. No amount of wishing, willing, desperate hopes, or quiet meditation had been sufficient. Wandless magic was hard, and he didn't even really know what he was doing. If not for Quirrell's word, he would have given up. But he was determined. He would get away again. He had questions, whole nests of them. Slytherin was a house at Hogwarts, one of 4, what were the others? The professor had been sidetracked and never actually told him what sorting was, or how it was important. Where was he to get a wand? When would the school year at Hogwarts begin? How would he get there? Did he need to buy a plane ticket or something? Why had he been sent to live with muggles who hated him if he was so rich and famous? Surely someone in the wizard world had wanted him? That thought always flatlined his eager curiosity. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling of his cupboard. Harry Potter, savior of the wizarding world, unwanted and foisted off on muggles who couldn't be rid of him because they were his relatives and there were laws. The wizards wanted a legend, not the nuisance of a boy. Am I unwanted? He whispered to the brown snake that lay half asleep on his stomach. He had always known before that he wasn't wanted, but that one night in the park he'd been so full of hope and imagination, so sure that any day a wizard would come whisk him away to a safe place where he was celebrated. But if they cared so much, why hadn't they come before now? We want you, the snake replied simply. If you speak of your own kind, we do not know. Not Master wants you, but cannot have you because of the interference of the Watcher. The Watcher? Harry asked, leaning forward. He had asked before what the Not Master part added to Quirrell's serpent name meant, but the snakes only said that was who he was and they could not call him otherwise. He'd never heard this term before. Was it someone who could hear snakes and not speak to them perhaps? The snake rolled its body in what Harry had come to interpret as a shrug. Not Master calls the one who controls you the Watcher. It is the Watcher who keeps your home concealed from Not Master, why he cannot come to you here and you must instead go to him. Harry relaxed back. That makes sense, he said quietly. He mentioned that my affairs were legally under the search control of another wizard. He turned his head, concentrated on the bars outside. The padlock. He tried to will them away, to make them vanish like the glass at the zoo had. He tried to pull up that feeling in his mind, throughout himself, to let the magic suffuse him. Nothing. Nothing. He tensed with frustration, wanted to scream, wanted to smash his fists against the door. But that would be disruptive to the Dursleys' lives, and he would be punished more. He pressed his eyes shut tight, screamed inside his mind instead. Days upon days of fruitless effort, the pain of desperation and constant failure compiled together into a dark rush of despair and self-loathing. Harry trembled with the emotional power, unable to find an outlet, screamed silently against the injustice of the world. Harry shook with suppressed sobbing, tears stinging his eyes. A surprised hiss came from the snake on his chest. It slithered away as though affronted. Harry pushed himself onto his elbows, watched the snake's movement. He was angry at himself for scaring his friend away, but noticed the slight shift in the light through the crack in the cupboard door. The bars were gone. He sat up straighter, pressed his ear against the door. The house was quiet. He slid the simple latch up, then pushed the door open. The padlock hung on the bar, which simply stopped before reaching the cupboard door. The other end was still there as well, but the center section where it actually blocked the door was just gone. Harry's frustration completely vanished in a burst of adrenaline and ecstasy. He had finally done it. He restrained his excitement, not wanting to betray himself with the slightest noise. He needed to get away from the house, and be able to get back in. Dudley wasn't out, so all the doors would be locked. He didn't know the code for the security system. That left the basement window. He could leave the basement door unlocked without anyone being alerted. Uncle Vernon had been unwilling to pay for security on a door that wouldn't pose a threat because everyone would believe he had security on all entrances. Harry tiptoed across the kitchen, pulled slowly and carefully on the latch. It let out a tiny squeak. It made him jump, but he was standing close enough he didn't think it would be noticed upstairs. He pulled the door open a centimeter at a time, slow, gradually, agonizingly slow, but he forced down his excitement and maintained the steady pace. Once it was open enough, he slipped through and pulled it shut behind him just as slowly and carefully. His heart was racing with excitement and worry. The latch barely clicked as he let it fall back in place. Letting out a breath, he started down the stairs. The eighth one creaked the moment he put weight on it and he froze. Silence. A single quiet drip of condensation from a pipe. Silence. He leaned the rest of his weight on the step, which groaned quietly, but it wasn't nearly as loud. He moved very slowly down the steps, testing each one before moving forward. He had no idea of the time. 2 days into his trials at wandless magic he had stopped counting in favor of devoting full attention to his attempts at bringing the magic out. Harry reached the window, but it was several feet above his head. He stood on his toes and still couldn't reach it. He looked around in the darkness. The faint illumination from the street light outside didn't show much besides the outline of the window painted on the floor in light. It didn't reflect enough to show the contents of the basement. He had been down enough times to be familiar with the general layout, but not recently. The Dursleys were not fastidious about rooms which did not entertain guests, and Harry worried that if he moved about carelessly he would trip or knock something over. Any sound he made would destroy his chances utterly. Uncle Vernon would think of an even more intricate way of keeping him in, and he didn't know if he'd be able to use wandless magic the same way again. His previous incidents had always been at least 10 days apart, and none of those were focused or deliberate. He couldn't afford to think about that yet. He would get away, he would return before anyone knew he was gone, and he would somehow reverse whatever magic he had done on the bars. Or at least he hoped it was reversible. If he couldn't change it back, he could imagine the Dursleys' wrath. They would know he had done something unnatural. Harry went down on his hands and knees, felt his way forward across the basement. The worn carpeting was rough against his hands, faintly damp with the night air. He found a pair of laundry baskets, but he knew they wouldn't support his weight without crumpling or breaking. Next he reached a collection of short boards from Uncle Vernon's attempts to improve the house against snake intrusion. They would be perfect to build a step stool, but Harry had neither the time nor skills for such a project. Behind the boards, Harry found his uncle's toolboxes. He ran a hand blindly along the first, testing the give of its lid and the weight of the material. It was hefty, meant to carry significant weight without bending. He stepped tentatively onto it, guessed he would need 3 to make a step and reach the window. They were heavy, but Harry was used to doing hard things without complaint or argument. He felt around the toolboxes and tried to memorize where they were stacked. He had to put everything back as close to the exact same position as he could. No one could know he was sneaking out. It took him probably 20 minutes to drag the toolboxes over to the window, then stack the third atop the other 2 to make a step. The box was too heavy for him to fully lift to the top, so he had to put one end up and lever it from there. And of course the moment he lifted the edge, all the contents shifted with a clatter. Harry froze, terrified. He wanted to drop the toolbox and run back to his cupboard, but he was in too far to go back now. He waited, heartbeat racing in his ears, straining for the sound of his uncle storming down the stairs in search of the intruder. No sound. No reply. If they had heard it, they must have discounted it as coming from a neighbor's house. Harry lifted the end again, the clatter softer this time as most of the tools had already shifted, set it atop the other 2, levered it into place. He carefully climbed up, wary in case his weight shifted anything or made the pile unstable, but his ascent produced no response from the stacked toolboxes. Harry reached up, wiggled the window open. He could get his arm out to the elbow if he stood on his toes. It took a good 10 minutes of straining and wriggling, but he finally rolled out the window onto the yard outside. He lay there for a long minute, staring at the stars, exhaling his exhaustion. Climbing up out a window used completely different muscles than he was used to employing in his chores or daily flights from Dudley. Once Harry had recovered, he crept down the drive, painstakingly slowly, until he was out of sight of number 4's windows, then broke into a run. He didn't run as fast or recklessly as he had the first time, maintained his outrunning Dudley without exhaustion pace the whole way to the park. It was dark, long since empty of any visitors. He crossed to their bench, shivering against the night chill. The Dursleys had confiscated the cloak the professor had lent him, and knowing them had probably burnt it or torn it into rags. He glanced around, then leaned down to the ground. "Nagini? Are you around?" He waited a few minutes for a reply, then stood again and set off down the pathway. He paused every few minutes, quietly called out for the professor's snake friend, but neither Nagini nor her master were in evidence. Harry's heart sank. All that effort, all that time, and he had come too late. If he stayed through the day, waited to meet them the next evening, there would be no concealing his absence. The Dursleys would know what he had done, and how he had escaped. They would lock the basement door with a padlock, board up his cupboard door each night, seal the window so it couldn't open fully. He couldn't stay. Even if he was caught trying to escape his cupboard, he couldn't let them know how he could leave the house. "Does anyone here know Nagini?" he whispered, low to the ground. There were few snakes out this time of night, but one did slither toward him. "Nagini and Master not Master send message for Master," the snake hissed. "Master not Master and Nagini needed for long time. Not able to come back, the Watcher is suspicious." Harry had thought his hopes couldn't be dashed any farther. He'd been wrong. He shivered again, tears blurring his eyes. "They're not coming back?" he asked, tremulously. He realized that he'd been speaking in English, switched to Parseltongue to repeat the question. "Master not Master is sorry, he knows it hurts you for him to leave. But it would hurt you both if the Watcher knew you had met. He says he will meet you in Diagonally, send word to him when you are to purchase your school things and he will be waiting for you in town." The word diagonally was obviously a mistranslation, but Harry didn't have context to place it properly. There were too many alternate possible words, and he still didn't entirely understand how snake minds worked. "Thank you," Harry said, his voice as dull and empty as his heart. He had risked so much, worked so hard, and he had missed him. How long ago was Master not Master here last? 2 mornings ago he left this message for you in the north. We would have brought it to your nest in another morning, but you came here first." Harry nodded numbly. 2 days too late. 1 day too early. He would have gotten the message without needing to sneak out. The whole thing was for nothing. Another tear dripped down his cheek. He shivered, hugged his arms across his chest, and began running back to Privet Drive. He didn't try to stop crying, at least out here alone he could give voice to his anguish. He'd been this way enough times with Dudley, he didn't need to look where he was going. Once he was nearer home, he'd have to return to being silent and meek. He found that beneath the fear and despair, there was something else building quietly within him. Anger. Whoever this Watcher was, he had a lot to answer for. If he was in charge of Harry's affairs in the wizard world, why hadn't he come around? Why hadn't he taken Harry away from here? Why was he keeping away the one person in his life who actually seemed to care about Harry's life? In a way, it was worse than never having anyone. Hope had been extended, a promise of aid. And then this Watcher had to ruin everything. Keeping his one advocate away from his home wasn't enough, now he had to prevent their meeting at all? Harry's sobs quieted, his fists tightened. Professor Quirrell had promised that this other wizard wanted him at Hogwarts too, so at least this school year he would be free of Dudley, free of the Dursleys, a way where he could learn to control his true power. Wasn't that hope enough? A boarding school for wizards, someplace he could make friends without them fearing retribution from his cousin and his thugs, someplace he could find who he really was when not suppressed and hounded. That was enough. He didn't need more. He didn't need answers to everything from his professor before the term began. Once he arrived at Hogwarts there would be plenty of time for the two of them to talk. Reason wasn't enough to stifle his deep disappointment completely, but as he ran he felt the cool night air whipping against him shift his perceptions. He could survive a few months more, and then he would be away for so long it might as well be forever. He rounded the corner to Privet Drive and nearly collided with Mrs. Fig. "Oh, there you are, dear," she said softly, catching his shoulders as he nearly toppled over in shock. "Are you feeling all right?" Harry blinked up at her in confusion. "What are you doing out this late?" he asked, puzzled. "I just got an owl, someone was worried about you." "An owl?" Harry asked incredulously, unsure what this had to do with anything. He'd always thought Mrs. Fig was a bit mad, with her house smelling of cabbage and her obsession with cats. "Yes, dear. Do come inside." Harry wriggled away from her hands, backed up a step. "It's very late, I should be getting home." Mrs. Fig's lips tightened, as though she were displeased. "Harry," she said softly, "I want you to know that you're always welcome to come over. I have watched you grow up and well, it isn't my place to criticize, but you have not had a very happy childhood. I give you my word, I will allow no harm to come to you if it is in my power to prevent it. If you ever need a safe place for a few hours, for a few days, my door is open to you." Harry blinked. He was confused and a bit taken aback by this. "Why are you telling me this now?" Mrs. Fig shook her head. "It would be better if we got indoors out of the cold. It's only just midnight, you've hours yet before your aunt and uncle wake up. I have a letter for you, and there are some things I can tell you now that you know the truth." Harry felt an eager shiver go through him. He knew immediately what truth he now knew, the truth about the wizard world hidden alongside the muggle reality he'd always known. It could be nothing else. "Did Professor Quirrell contact you?" he asked. "Is that who was worried?" Mrs. Fig nodded. "He said you would probably be running past my house within the hour, that I should invite you in and explain as much as I could. It's not a lot, mind, I am very out of touch with come inside first, then we can talk freely." "Are you a witch, then?" Harry asked in a whisper. Mrs. Fig shook her head, a sad look passing across her face. "No, dear. I'm a squib." It's what we call non-magic people born into a magic family. It's not a common affliction, thank goodness, but it is mine. I've never quite fit into either world. She opened her front door, ushered Harry into its inviting warm interior, and for once he didn't really mind the smell of cabbages. She hung up her coat, set her handbag on a waiting table with the exact same steps she always used. Harry smiled faintly at that, strangely reassured by the familiar movement of his off-babysitter. She was the same confusing woman whether she knew about wizards or not. Harry slipped off his shoes as she changed out of her boots, followed her into the sitting room. Ornamented frames lined the mantel, pictures of her many cats over the years arrayed in careful precision. Though much of the house had thin layers of dust covering everything and rooms frequently had wisps of only partly removed spider web hanging from the corners, the mantel was always freshly dusted. It made Harry sad, thinking about Mrs. Figg being as unsuited for the Muggle world as he, and not even able to escape to the wizard world. No wonder she had only her succession of cats for company. She picked up a thick envelope from the table. There you are, dear. Once you've read it, I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have as far as I'm able. The envelope was addressed simply, Harry Potter, no street name or box number. He accepted it almost reverently. He had never gotten mail before, not even a solicitation. He might as well not have existed as far as the rest of the world were concerned. The envelope was of a thick parchment-like paper, probably the most expensive paper he'd ever seen. The letter inside was the same material. Harry was disappointed to find it was only a single page. The thickness of the envelope was all due to the weight of the page. Both the envelope and the paper inside were addressed in bright green ink, shimmering slightly as though it hadn't quite dried yet, but it was not wet nor did it smudge when he ran a finger over it curiously. He held the folded letter for a long minute, staring at it. Mrs. Figg said about making a pot of tea, weak nasty stuff that he'd always thought tasted like hay. She didn't interrupt his reverie, humming to herself in a quiet voice that only made him feel less alone. The letterhead was a shield crest divided in fourths, a different creature in each. Snake, badger, lion, raven. Harry placed a finger lightly on the snake. He knew what that represented. Slytherin, his legacy. He stared for a long moment, then moved on to the letter's text. Harry. I'm sorry I couldn't meet you in person. I'm sure you had a beastly time getting away, and I wish I didn't have to disappoint you like this. As you may have heard, I've been unavoidably detained with school affairs and legal matters. It also seems some have taken issue with my attempts to contact you, and any future trips to your area would be detected and monitored. For your safety as well as my own, we must now conduct our affairs at a distance until you arrive here in September. Arabella is trustworthy. She has been positioned as your gatekeeper for many years now. As any attempt to contact you at your relative's house is diverted either by your Muggle guardians or the spells placed there by your magical watcher, I will send any letters for you to her and you can reply through her as well. If there is anything you need, anything at all, tell me and I will do my best to get it to you. I can't do anything about your relatives, unfortunately. The magical law is firm upon where that decision lies, and your custodian is adamant that their home is the best place for you. I strenuously object to such base treatment of a wizard before whom your relatives would barely rank as capable slaves, much less guardians, but I am in no position to change the state of affairs. Again, you have my sincerest sympathy and I only wish I could do more. Harry had to stop reading for a moment. Though he'd thought himself through with crying for the night, he felt tears of relief in his eyes. He wasn't forgotten. Someone cared about what happened to him. He accepted the handkerchief Mrs. Figg silently dropped beside him as she walked past with her tea, brought himself under search control, turned the page over and resumed reading. I look forward to teaching you this year. I have an advanced curriculum drawn up in case you're interested in individual tutoring. Since most wizarding children have the advantage of growing up in our world, there is too much to tell you in a letter, or even in a week of discussion. I had hoped to catch you up to the present before the school term began, but I'm afraid you will have to get by on your own until September. Remember, you are famous and powerful in our world. Everyone will know you, accept their gratitude with dignity and poise. Try not to let it go to your head. Try to see past the fawning to who can be a genuine help to you in future and who would just ride your coattails in hopes of your greatness somehow rubbing off on them by association. Speak vaguely when possible. Try not to promise anything to anyone until you know exactly what you are committing to. This is important, more so to a wizard. Your word must be your bond, you must act with care, and you must not lightly promise things now that may come back to entangle you in future years. I wish I could teach you in person. You can't imagine how sorry I am not to be able to see you again for so long. Until then, be strong, be cunning, and stay in touch. Your friend, Professor Quirinus Quirrell. Harry found new tears slipping down his cheek. One dripped onto the letter, but the ink didn't smudge even then. Your friend. No one had ever said those words to him before. Harry held the letter tight to his chest, wiped his eyes with the handkerchief. He looked over to Mrs. Figg, who was pouring out the tea for the two of them. Thank you, he whispered. Oh, it's no trouble at all, dear. He didn't mean the tea, but he couldn't put his thoughts into words just then. He took the warm drink, sipped at it, and found its sweet grassy flavor somehow pleasing today. As though the unexpected glow of happiness within him made everything around him better by association.